Hello, Sophie here with a grease pencil experiment that I am so excited to share. So a while back, just through poking around within Blender, I discovered the statistics. So these tell me how many layers exist within a grease pencil object. They also tell me the number of frames, points, and strokes. So let's talk strokes. Because I've noticed a similar feature in Procreate, it also counts the number of strokes that you've made in a project. But in a program like Procreate, this number is strictly cumulative. Unless you undo strokes right after making them, there is no way to go back and remove a stroke. But within Blender, because it's a vector program, every single stroke exists independently from one another, and they can always be selected in edit mode. If you were to select and delete strokes, for example, the stroke count would go down. And the same thing would happen if you were to select and join strokes, meaning that stroke count within Blender is a number that can go up and down. And sometimes, just out of curiosity, I do like to check on the stroke count of a piece. Now I want to clarify that stroke count doesn't mean that much. It doesn't matter how many strokes you used in a piece, as long as the final piece looks how you want it to and you're happy with it. But since my pieces tend to use such a high number of strokes, I have been really wanting to just give myself the challenge and seeing what I can create with as few strokes as possible. So I made the same painting 3 times. I gave myself a 1-hour time limit for each piece. And so the first piece had no stroke limit, and it ended up at around 1,250 strokes. The second piece ended up at 350 strokes. And finally, I made a full painting using only 50 strokes. Here is the result of all of that. But first, I actually filmed myself talking through the process making all 3 pieces, and so I've edited that footage down for this video. But if you'd like to see the full versions, all 3 hours of this challenge, they're available on my Patreon and also via my Gumroad. I make narrated process videos like this every month with a different theme. I love making them, and if you want to check it out, I would really appreciate it. Thank you. So I do want to dive right in for this first piece. So this is the reference image I found. I just thought it would be fun to work from. I'm going to focus on the portrait exclusively, the face, for this piece. So I'll start, I want to give this piece a background color, and I will do that using the world color here. So I'm noticing kind of that grayish sort of green in the background, but it's maybe more like a very desaturated warm red orange. I think I'll start with this. So I spent the first 15 minutes sketching. Since I wasn't worried about stroke count at this point, it was okay if I drew over the same area multiple times, and my stroke count already started going up pretty fast. How many strokes am I at? I'm already almost at 100 strokes, so that's going to be interesting if that's like my goal for the final piece. That might be totally impossible, but we shall see. I started to get some intricate detailing already here in this stage of the process, which I don't often do, and I also started to indicate some of the values. So now for painting. Oh my gosh. So this is kind of something that I did more when I started using grease pencil. I had a set of gradient materials. And so the way that I used grease pencil at the start with materials like this is I would create fill shapes, and I would have, the gradient inside of these fill shapes. This is also how I would use textures, like just making shapes and having gradients and textures being within those shapes. But then as of Blender 3.5, there is the stroke outline feature. So this allows me to make strokes, and the texture or the gradient shows up within these strokes. So rather than having to draw a fill shape or outline the fill shape, I can just make strokes, and those strokes will contain a fill texture or a gradient texture like this. I'm gonna start with one of my lighter gradients, and I am just gonna start on the same layer, seeing what I can do painting on top of my sketch. So I spent the next 15 minutes adding a base layer of colors with my gradient brushes. I started with gradients that are quite transparent, and so I made use of a lot of strokes layered on top of one another to build up my piece. My values all started pretty mid-tone, and so I worked up to the intense lights and darks that I saw in my reference image. And then around the end of this first 30 minutes, I started defining the different facial features like the eyes and the mouth. All right, we're back. I'm excited, and so like I mentioned, I will be diving right in to using my pencil sketching brush to start brushing in some details, some colors. I had a look, and we're at 400 strokes for this piece. And for the rest of the piece, I combined the two methods that I've used so far, using both my sketching brush with a stroke material to draw in details, as well as my gradient brushes to fill in big shapes of color very quickly. What I tend to do when I'm rendering is I'll look back and forth from my reference image to my piece and notice what stands out to me as being different or wrong, and I'll fix that. And I like to move around my piece a lot. For the background, I added a gradient that goes from light at the top to dark at the bottom. And so I did this using gradients, but this also creates harsh edges between the stroke shapes. So then I went in with my pencil brush and scribbled in texture so that this new texture would create more soft edges between these strokes. I think this ear, like some of these sketch lines, are too much, so I'll just go and I'll delete them. Oh, look at that. I'm at 1,000 strokes for this first piece. That's a good amount, I feel like. So yeah, I want this ear to be indicated, but I don't want it to draw too much attention, so I felt like a lot of these initial sketch lines, you know, they're very dark. And then I did delete some strokes, but really not a lot. I mostly added strokes throughout this first process. At 1,250 strokes approximately, this is how a 1-hour painting of this lion portrait would look like if I were just adding strokes recklessly, with reckless abandon. You can see the kind of textures I can get, mostly using individual pencil strokes, pencil lines to get texture. And here is the final piece of this first phase of the experiment. Also, a little fun fact, 1,250 strokes is 20 strokes a minute, or a stroke every 3 seconds. So I'm thinking my goal, my aim is 500 strokes, but I'm gonna give myself like the wiggle room of being able to go up to 600. So this piece is the in-between from having no stroke limit to having a very extreme stroke limit. And the process does reflect that. It's a bit of a mix between the two different processes. Once again, I used the first 15 minutes for the sketch, but now I was more mindful to not just needlessly draw strokes. So like rather than using multiple strokes to make a section darker, I focused on getting that with fewer strokes and using my pen pressure and brush opacity more intentionally. So last week, I've already started using some of my pencil strokes to shade in areas. And I think I have the flexibility and stroke count to do that again this week. Raising my brush size because all of these shadow shapes, I am still trying to make them like a single stroke where I can. Maybe I'll even join these. And that's something I may do, not even just for stroke count, just because of the way grease pencil strokes overlap on top of one another. Like, if they're separate strokes, you see a pretty obvious opacity difference where they overlap. So joining strokes is the other way that you can reduce stroke count in Blender, because multiple strokes become one stroke. So I played around with that a bit in this sketching phase, but it's not something that I do very often. And now I'm gonna start using my gradient brushes to start filling in this piece. So this is interesting because this stroke already, I meant to have it be in the background, like just in the background, but it was bigger than I thought it would be, so it like overlapped on top of the lion, but that's kind of good because I'm trying to keep stroke count low. And so having strokes do more than one thing, like having the stroke be not exclusively for the background, but also it's starting to shade in this part of the lion, which, like, let's be honest, is it's pretty in shadow already. So that is actually pretty useful. And the next 15 minutes was about adding gradient strokes to start filling in colors. But now I was really intentional about how they would show up, and so I used different grease pencil tools to modify them. More on those tools a bit later on though. Saving on a bit of space. How do I just have 91 strokes? Well, that bodes well for next week. Oh my gosh, am I even gonna make it up to 500 strokes at like this conservative an approach? And I do also want to make use of my pencil brush, especially for fine details, fine areas like this, but I'm trying to think about making just one stroke at a time. And for the rest of the piece, I used both a pencil brush and my gradient brushes to do a combination of adding big shapes of color and also scribbling in some pencil texture. But I'm also often going into other modes to modify the gradient strokes, and I'm being careful with my pencil strokes to keep the scribble lines to as few individual strokes as I can. So how is my stroke count looking? 130. That feels wrong. I would have estimated in the 200s, but okay. And so I just spent the rest of this hour, like for the first painting, looking back and forth from reference image to my piece, fixing anything that looks off, and building up to those extreme lights and darks. So after an hour, here is what the in-between piece of this challenge looks like. It consists of 350 strokes, which is 5.8 strokes a minute, or a stroke every 10 seconds. Alright, now we're getting to the really exciting part, trying to recreate this painting with only 50 strokes. So for reference, 50 strokes in 1 hour is 0.8 strokes a minute, or a stroke every 1.33 minutes. So given that I'll be spending, on average, nearly a minute and a half on each stroke, I will definitely spend more time modifying strokes than actually creating new strokes. Luckily, there are so many grease pencil tools that I can use to modify these strokes, and this part of the video will be a look at those tools and how I use them. I spent the first 5 minutes of this hour sketching. I had decided that I would delete all of my sketch lines later on in my process, and so they are purely to indicate proportions, and so I wasn't too worried about keeping their count small. So the first thing I want to do is the background. So in the previous weeks, for each of them, I went with this gradient from light to dark, light at the top, dark at the bottom, but I did this using multiple gradient strokes. And so this week I'm going to try to achieve this with 2 or 3 strokes only. So I'm just going to press hard and draw up. So that created this gradient, and I will use the transform fill tool, the translate option, just to move where this gradient shows up. I'm not a big fan of this color I chose, so this is in vertex paint mode. I want to brush in a bit of green. So I use the draw tool for this. So you can kind of see the scale is pretty small on this stroke, just with the way that it was drawn. So the transition is pretty abrupt from having no gradient to having like the full gradient. So now I can use the scale to increase the length of the gradient so that I can have it start sooner, but also have it be less intense at the top of the canvas like this. So let me just draw that. But I'm not super happy with how this gradient looks, so I will spend some time modifying it. I'm not sure if I want to have the most saturated part at the top of the head like this. I think I want to increase the scale so that the gradient is a longer transition so that I can have it fill more of my canvas without getting quite so intense and saturated. So now I think I'm going to do a similar gradient, or actually what I can do, maybe with this stroke selected, I can duplicate it, and maybe I'll recolor it to be like a darker red, and then I'll go into edit mode and use my transform fill tool to change how it shows up. So I want a stroke for the nose like this. I'll smooth it out, and then the dark part of the mane down here. So I'm making like a big stroke. That's kind of nice. And I'll also be modifying the shape of it down here. So I can create kind of an outline look like this here by having it go past the edges of the lion portrait. I think I will send it to the back, and then I can bring it forward a few times to have it show up in front of some strokes but behind other strokes. Can I try to do this all in one stroke? Let's try. So I want it to be like this, and then up here, and then like this, and like this. And actually, like, the geometry of this stroke is so complex that I actually have some room to start sculpting in some fur details in this way. Like kind of just some jagged edges, which are meant to represent fur. So I've been kind of just like modifying this based on the geometry as I had it when I drew it. But I would really like for the top of the mane to have more of these like fur spikes because I think it's a good spot for it. So what I do now is I go into edit mode and I use point select mode. I almost always stay in stroke select mode except for when I do this. And then with the lasso tool in the selection mode I can drag to deselect. So, because I want just this top part of the stroke to remain selected because it doesn't have very much geometry. And then what I can do is right click and subdivide to add more geometry to give myself more room to add some like fur jaggedness. Want to do this light part of the face, but definitely modifying the gradient. I should be able to modify them simultaneously and get kind of the same look. And I'm currently at 20 strokes. I want a little dark stroke here to kind of outline the head. It's now just looking very vector art, I find, and adding some strokes might help it to look more painterly. So maybe I'll do that now. So I can start with a little eye indication, trying to indicate this eye as simply as I can. And I think these details at the top are pretty important to the lion's expression. Also, what's cool about strokes that we can't do with gradients is recoloring them. A gradient or like a fill texture can only be one color, but strokes we can actually recolor. I'll shrink down my brush to show you. We can recolor only part of them at a time. And if anything, this kind of like gives me a gradient in this way. I did want to do a bit of definition to the muzzle here. So one thing that is like bugging me so hard is this like transition area here. It's just, I don't like it. So I think I'm going to use some strokes. I'm going to try to just draw one single continuous stroke, filling in the whole area. And then what's cool about strokes, is I have this stroke and now I can select it, and there's so many ways that I can modify it. I can go into sculpt mode and like I can modify the strength of it. I can modify how like its position like this. So like I basically drew that stroke just to fill in the area without worrying too much about how hard or light I was pressing, because those are all things I can modify later on. And now I'm going to recolor this stroke so that it blends into the background, to the mane better. I'll go into draw mode and use the eyedropper tool just to select this color because it's very specific. So I use the palette selection. So that is this color here that just got added. So with the vertex paint tool, I can recolor it that color at the top here. So we're getting kind of like this transition. I can go into sculpt mode and make the top of this stroke more saturated, or more strong, I mean. So when I draw a stroke like this, I'm just thinking about filling in all the areas that I wanted to fill in. Okay, I'm gonna use my stroke to do a bit of a gradient here. And maybe just also some like stroke, some like fur textures here. I think I wanted to go a bit more like this, but I also use the thickness brush to increase it on the edges. And then by holding control, I can decrease it on the inside. I should have done this sooner. This is so cool. And then I can go into vertex paint mode and recolor it so that it's like, vertex paint mode and recolor it so that it's darker at the start and kind of more of a, cool, like soft transition. And then later at the ends, I am gonna be making more of these strokes because that was so cool. So I want to do like I did with that stroke, but here, because that was so cool. So I have this stroke, and then I use the thickness tool to increase it here and then decrease it here and get fur strands. I want for this strand of fur here. Let me make the most of this and also have it kind of going into here. Yeah, I'm gonna mess with the colors a bit more, but I do want to go more opaque with it because I'm trying to what I'm trying to do is cover up some solid lines. Nice. How did I want to go? Did I want to go light for it? Maybe. Yes. The answer is yes. Do a bit of fur detailing here. And yeah, I'm getting like 2 separate stroke shapes, strand shapes. This, I would not believe that this was like 1 stroke. The one I'm doing right now, like this is 1 stroke. It's magic. To make this whole part lighter a little bit. Have it be longer on both sides though. Are you seeing this? This single stroke. Are you kidding me? Because I am obsessed. I'm just gonna keep using my pencil brush and scribbling, and I want a more orange base. So I will just color this, select this stroke in edit mode, send it to the back, and then I want to bring it forward a few times so that it's in front of the background strokes like this. I'm just trying to think, what can I do with these last 3 strokes? Add a bit of details to the ear. This part of the mane, it's feeling like it needs it. The last stroke. All right, so now that a few weeks has passed since I did this experiment, what are my final thoughts? Honestly, my initial thoughts is that I don't love any of them, but I think that speaks more to the time constraint. You know, I like to spend multiple hours on a single piece, and it's hard to look at these without seeing just how much more I want to refine them, so I'm gonna set that aside. I'm honestly really impressed with what I got with the 3rd painting. I love that it made me discover a method that I never would have thought of using before. It was honestly so much fun to make and to try something new. In a similar way, the first piece is unique because at one point I started adding like individual small strokes just to raise my stroke count, and I think it's a cool effect. Like, there's a lot of subtle color variation. It makes me think kind of a mosaic look. But for me, there's one aspect of painting that trumps all others, and that is emotion. And while painting number 3 makes me think of a cool stylized logo, and painting number 1 gives me a bit more cartoony vibes, with painting 2, I just look into those eyes and I feel soul in there. What I love about this process of painting number 2 is that I wasn't just adding strokes and adding strokes, I also spent a lot of time going into other grease pencil modes and modifying what I have. This gave me time to pause to consider what I have and how I could improve it. For me, painting by just adding strokes, it starts to get really repetitive and honestly a bit boring. And so I thrive on switching up that process with other tools. But compared to painting 3, I do also need some time to add strokes freely because too much modifying and tweaking strokes can also cause me to lose sight of the piece as a whole. Integrating into my process, taking breaks, taking a step back, changing things up, it really helps me when I get into that like hyper-focus headspace of just adding strokes, or on the other end, modifying strokes. Having that variation helps me to get out of that autopilot hyper-focus headspace, and I'm always better off for it. Meaning that the moral of the story is balance. Oh, who'd have thought? So corny. That is all my thoughts. That is the video. I hope that it was interesting. I had such a great time putting this together. Thank you so much for watching. And just a reminder that you can find the full narrated process videos along with my blend file downloads over on Patreon and Gumroad. I really appreciate any support, but even just liking, commenting, subscribing, all of that helps me out a lot, so thank you. You can find me all over the internet at Sophie Jantak. I will see you very soon. Take care. Bye.